Okay, folks, welcome to this session. Thank you for your interest and participation in the 6th Annual Power and Privilege Symposium at the University of Alaska Southeast. In particular, I'd like to offer much gratitude to those who have scrambled behind the scenes to help put this together as we shift to a virtual conference. It's just kind of the way that things go these days. It gets a little interesting. Let's see, do I have the ability to share? I think I do, okay. So just to let you folks know what we're in for today, we're gonna look at some slides here. I'm going to try and keep the chat open, although I will try and reserve time at the end for discussion. So what we are looking at in this particular session is adding Indigenous content and protecting cultural safety here at the Power and Privilege Symposium at the University of Alaska Southeast. Shukwa ayakoa hasta anika yejitune akwan gunashish anyat kusani ewi anika yejachane hayukatangi kahakosti yitat kakaha ako hasti ich khateshi chadu saditu wasaku hashishko has atwaskuku akhande haswa adi Kashukat ku'u, wan kanin slidzi, shkun klein atunach aya, ya anakuti. Yak echawe ko'akan chish. I first want to acknowledge the noble people of the Ak Kwan, upon whose land I reside and work. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to reside here, to work here. My role is to help people learn about Indigenous peoples, perspectives, Tlingit language, language revitalization, equity, cultural safety. And I want to start by just talking about land acknowledgement. This particular acknowledgement comes out of the Hatuch Lachish Coalition. And so we've workshopped it a few times. We've incorporated some feedback. I do want to acknowledge that the campus of UAS resides on Ak Kwan land. We do extend a lot of our work, however, into some areas that are Taku Kwan. That's the land of the Taku people. Because of that, I usually include them in a land acknowledgement, although I would begin it by saying, I live and reside on the land of the Ak Kwan people. Just a word about land acknowledgements. These things have been trending. I've a number of students who have talked about land acknowledgements. I think it's great. I think it's great to see, but I think some of the things I look for is some specifics, like who, what do they call themselves? How specific can we get? And I like to look at acknowledging some of the hardships and realities of colonialization. In particular, was their village burnt down, like it was in Douglas? What kinds of things might have happened to them? I'm gonna turn my spell check thing on. And then also, what kind of commitments can we make to improvements? Maybe I'll try this. Can you folks see it okay? Does it show up? Okay.
That looks like presenter mode, Lance.
What's that?
It looks like we see it in presenter mode now instead of.
Okay, I'll stick with this. Maybe it was going on the other monitor. Okay, I'll just stay with this. So we reside on the unceded territories of the Ak Kwan and Taku Kwan, on what is currently known as Juneau and Douglas, Alaska. We acknowledge that Tlingit peoples have been stewards of this land since time immemorial, and we are grateful for that stewardship and incredible care. We recognize the series of unjust actions that attempted to remove them from their land, which includes forced relocations and the burning of villages. We honor the relationships that exist between Tlingit peoples, their lands, their ancestors, and future generations. We aspire to work toward healing and liberation, recognizing our paths are intertwined in the complex histories of colonization in Alaska. We acknowledge that we arrived here by listening to the people's elders' lessons from the past, and these stories carry us as we weave a healthier world for future generations. So we're going to kind of start there, and then we're going to sort of, I want to go over some of the things that we're going to talk about, but I got to tell you who I am. So you'll be able to read a rough translation. So Achtu yake, which in chasati, yach, yayaki, Koneaya achsai, dekina chatsati, chashukach adi, ach ish has ayupik, kasami, ka English. Ka'i chashatu, University of Alaska Southeast, Uchyach awe, Uchyach yedashawe uhan. Ade shliach aya yach wuchin yejitune. I want to thank you all for Zooming all day. I don't know, we Zoom all day, Zoom all night. Zoom's just our new clan house, place of residence, workspace, whatever. But I really appreciate the efforts to make this work during a pandemic. We talked about pandemics in class yesterday. It wasn't that long ago when some villages lost 90% of their people. So when we encounter a pandemic, I tend to think about the historical traumas that can kick up, and how brutal it can be to just go into this survival of the fittest type of mode, because I do believe that was something employed to take the land from Indigenous peoples. If you want to contact me, my information is down here on the right. I'm happy to engage in dialogues about decolonization. Happy to answer questions, help people in some of your work. If your work is in this field of equity, making sure people are seen, making sure people can be themselves, and making sure that the environment is safe, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. You know, sometimes we think freedom of speech means you could just say and do whatever you want, but it's not always the case. And so how do we navigate some of these things? And because we live on Tlingit ʼunei, this isn't just anywhere USA. And so there's a number of things that I think I'm hoping we'll continue to think about. And as faculty, that will have the tools to be able to engage and to create and maintain safe environments. And that means people can be themselves, even if they disagree. But that means that disagreement should not be interfering with someone else being themselves, which is a challenge. It's a hard thing to do. I think we live in polarizing times. Maybe we always have. And so let's look at what we're going to try and do in this next 50 minutes here. So that's what's going to happen, theoretically. We're going to talk about adding Indigenous content. So when we talk about that, we're going to talk about moving towards inclusion and being very conscious about what that means, what it looks like, what kind of steps we might have to take. I'm thinking about that after listening to the panel, after listening to other discussions. Is this a place that people can see themselves? And is this a place where people feel like they belong? My hope is people feel like they belong, even if they listen to me and they say, I really disagree with what you're saying. I want them to feel like they're still in a home and we're sitting around and we're sharing knowledge, which is a sacred thing. We're going to talk about the Alaska Native graduation requirement. We're going to talk about Indigenous intellectual authority. Under protecting cultural safety, we're going to go over some critical terms. I think it's pretty important to have pretty solid definitions of things, because if you could just call anything, it's really hard to engage in discussions on power and privilege and change. We're going to talk about conscious restructuring. And what does that mean? And then we're going to talk about equity as policy. And then we're going to see if we got some time to just chat. So let's start, thinking about this. So when we're looking at people, you can have exclusion, which means you're not allowed in. And this could be radical, whites only, like those signs used to exist here in Southeast Alaska. And then there could be exclusions from other people from other things, right? There could be indigenous things going on, and maybe you're not invited. And there could be indigenous things, and maybe you are invited, right? And so when we look at that, but what is an institution of higher education? It's a public institution, UAS is. We have an obligation to everybody. And I'll tell you what, everybody does not succeed at the same level. Everybody does not start from the same place. And what I see consistently in education is unacceptable rates of failure when it comes to indigenous peoples and other peoples from communities of color. I also see the maintenance of unsafe spaces for people, for our relatives who are members with the LGBTQ plus community, with our members who are from other places who may be getting treated differently because of who they are. So you can move from exclusion to integration, which is like, oh yeah, we'll let you in, but you were over there. And this happens academically within curricula. This happens within, it's very easy to just sort of sit in this comfort phase, right? So these are the segregated neighborhoods. And this is also what we'll look at with content. It's related to content as well. Then inclusion is everybody's just everywhere. When you go places, you just see people. So if, for example, if Alaska is 20% Alaska Native, we should just be seeing 1 out of 5 people is Alaska Native. And if they're not, then what's going on? What do we got here? And so there's going to be things that not everything's for everybody. But when we look at sort of where we're trying to go in terms of equity and diversity, and we're going to look at what these terms kind of mean. So then you have the content, right? So this could be the students, this could be the faculty, this could be the administration. You could look at some of this stuff and say, do we see them everywhere? If we look at every department at the University of Alaska Southeast, do we see diversity in every department? And if not, what are we going to do about it? It takes action and it takes conscious efforts to reshape institutions. Then we look at content and we say, what about the indigenous voices? Where are they? Do they exist in every program that we have? Do we have students who graduate who cannot name 20 prominent Alaska Native people and the 23 Alaska Native languages? And if they're graduating from here, and like this is higher education. Theoretically, there's no higher education. Whose responsibility is it to change some of those factors? I want people to know William Paul. I want people to know Elizabeth Parachovich, Howard Rock. I want them to know what's a tribe, what's a heritage nonprofit, what's an ANCSA corporation. That's basic stuff. That should be just common knowledge, and I don't think it is. So then you can have marginalized curriculum. So it's like, yeah, okay, you could do that, but that's not part of what we do. That's not the core. So when you get into, so we've been infiltrating the GERs the past few years to try and diversify the GERs, because there was a time here where theater was considered a fine art GER, art history, intro to drawing, a number of different things. But what wasn't was Northwest Coast art, history and culture, carving, design, weaving. Those classes were not considered fulfilling fine arts GER requirements. And we've changed that. So then you also want inclusion. So inclusion means Indigenous courses are now part of the standard, and Indigenous content is now all over the place. And so it shouldn't be unusual. And we also should not have programs and departments where you don't engage in any Indigenous content. I just don't see how that's going to be possible to carry forward and not say we're an institution of white supremacy. So the Alaska Native graduation requirement was one step that helps to move us in a different direction. We got to just push the needle a little bit towards the center. So this is thanks to the Alaska Native Studies Council, which is a group of faculty throughout the University of Alaska, so at UAA, UAF, UAS, Iliksavik Tribal College, and also the Alaska Pacific University. And so we look at how can we support each other. We hosted the Alaska Native Studies Conference. We also strategize on what kind of changes can we implement. And one of the top things, which the Board of Regents has responded to, is we have a decline in Alaska Native faculty throughout the University of Alaska. And we are only 3%, 20% of the student body, 3% of the faculty. What are you going to do about it? Also, student governments, we had a lot of support from student governments, including UAS. Faculty Senate was on board with this idea, at the Board of Regents, and also the administrators of UAS, UAA, UAF. So I just want to read to you what we put in the catalog, because there's some specific intention with what we're trying to do here. The University of Alaska Southeast is situated upon the ancestral home of the living and vibrant cultures of the Haida, Tlingit, and Tsimshian peoples. In order to fulfill the UAS mission and to maintain itself as a world-class destination for interdisciplinary research and study, for which it bears great potential, the Alaska Native Knowledge graduation requirement has been adopted at the University of Alaska Southeast in order to graduate with a baccalaureate degree. So if you want to get a four-year degree, you have to take 3 credits of courses that are on this list that satisfy the Alaska Native Knowledge graduation requirement. It ensures that all graduates of UAS programs have a basic level of knowledge when it comes to Indigenous peoples of Alaska. That's what we'll just go for basic. I'd like more, but let's start there. This requirement does not add to the total number of credits required for general education requirements. So it's not adding to the credit load, although if degree programs are highly structured, so there's not very many options for going outside of what classes they expect to take, then they might be challenged. But if they're challenged, that means their content is probably not diverse when it comes to specifics of Alaska Native peoples and Indigenous studies. And so, and coming back, like we're open to adding courses to this list, we being the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Alaska Native Education. That's the committee that reviews proposals for courses to be considered. But down here it says courses have Alaska Native languages and or ways of knowing as the intellectual focus of the class, and not as one of many subjects that are examined through a non-Indigenous intellectual framework. So this is not a perspective, an external perspective on Indigenous peoples. This is not, we teach this history course and we touch on no, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for some specifics in terms of Indigenous thought worlds, Indigenous languages, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous organizations. I do believe that our education systems keep these things invisible, because if we don't think about them, we don't have to acknowledge how important they are to the state of Alaska, to Juneau, to our university. And so we're going to push back against that with some of this specific language. And I want you to know why, because if you're out there advising folks and they might say, well, how come I got to do this? This is the reason why. It's because you live and reside on land that belongs historically and ancestrally to Indigenous peoples, and you should honor that relationship. So Indigenous intellectual authority. So this is, I've been told this is a threatening thing, and I really do not believe that. And I'm fully ready to engage in debates. I'm not looking for it, but I'm ready for it. If you want to talk about this, and if you want, I had highly fluent, very tough Tlingit elders come up to me and say, which means I'm going to challenge you. And that meant they were going to say something in Tlingit that's going to be impossible to understand. And so I'm ready. If you want to debate, I'm ready. I had a colleague who was trying to force me to define Indigenous in a way that I think was satisfactory to him. And at some point I just said, well, this is just what it is. And you could think whatever you want. This is what it is, how it works. Everybody's indigenous to somewhere, but once you go and colonize a place, you're not indigenous to that place. So how do you transform a department or a program from exclusive to inclusive? Well, I think I'll start with a couple of philosophical things. One is listen, go tune into the conversation. And if your instinct is, ooh, this person's angry or mean, you need to overcome that instinct, because I think that instinct is a little voice inside you that's saying, don't let them change it, man. Don't let them change it. Well, I don't want to share. I mean, I don't know. That's my theory. But listening, having compassion, engaging in thoughtful manners, and understanding that you might have been taught something that's not very accurate and that's not very equitable. So increased diversity, right? Can the University of Alaska, with all of its resources, with all of its people, with all the brains and the degrees and everything that's there, can the university just set a goal? We'll be 10% Alaska Native faculty by 2025. Now we gotta, you can't just get in a boat and just wander around the ocean. You have somewhere to go. So if you got somewhere to go, now maybe you can get there. And then maybe we could set a higher goal. If we could hit 20%, we're at equity. But at this point, that means, I can't remember the numbers that Joe Nelson crunched for us, but I think it was close to 100 new Alaska Native faculty throughout the University of Alaska, which, there may be a counter argument there. Oh, well, they just don't exist. Well, there's ways. There are ways, but it's not going to happen unless we consciously make changes. Partner with Alaska Native organizations. If you work at UAS, especially if you're a faculty member, what is your program or department doing specifically with tribes, with ANCSA corporations, with consortia, with heritage organizations? There's millions and millions of dollars there. You can increase the flow of students to your program. If you are studying something, you could turn your research towards Alaska Native communities with the intention of not how can I study you, but how can I help? How can I be part of a vibrant community? How can I contribute? We have knowledge flowing through our institution. How can that knowledge reach out and help potentially solve problems without being pushy or assumptive? But how can we be a partner? And then how can we have your students choose to come here because we are invested directly in your community? I don't know if that's happening with all of our departments. I'd say it's not happening with all of our departments. But let's figure out how to make it happen. We're gonna have to build a few more working groups, do some other stuff. You have one tenure track. Well, I guess no, you have, I think 4 now tenure track Alaska Native faculty, but 4 out of 100, it's gonna have to be someone else who's doing it as well, okay? Recognize tribal sovereignty. Self-governance and self-determination should be brought to the table in the form of co-governance. We have about 19 tribes in Southeast Alaska. Now, what are we doing? How are we bringing them to the table? Do they have a role in the governance of the university? Do they have a role? We're on collectively their land. We are dealing with collectively their communities and their children, and their people. And so we need to honor that and elevate that to a high status. Just because the state of Alaska doesn't mean that we have to follow suit. We're intelligent people. We can just look. We say, okay, that's what the federal government says. Those are tribes. We work with those tribes in very specific ways. Now, on the philosophical side, incorporating decolonial practices. Give space and safety to students. This means we're going to have to just raise our levels of awareness of when things might be crossing this threshold into being a threat to Indigenous peoples. I encounter threats a lot. I wrote a paper for an upper level English class decades ago, and it was about language revitalization. I got a C. I didn't get any comments on the paper. It just said, why doesn't everybody speak English? That was it. Just let your language die, right? And I mean, I don't know. And so Are we creating environments where everybody has a chance to succeed? Or are we just modeling what we feel an institution of learning is? Because an institution of learning is probably a pretty damaging thing when it comes to Indigenous peoples. Allow Indigenous students to see themselves in your course and in your program. Are you talking about Oscar Coagley? Do you know what his research was about? Are you talking about Ernestine Hayes? Is her voice coming into your class and touching people? Because it should. What are you doing? How you are a gatekeeper to knowledge if you are a faculty member. You are the one who controls what people look at. And you need to make that and use that power and that privilege to help us out. Incorporate Indigenous contributions. Seek out Indigenous authors, publish Indigenous authors. If your answer is, well, there's no Indigenous content in the field that I work in, well, then you are in that field and you can help create publications, co-author stuff, elevate people, find content, change the canon. You can't just say, well, that's the canon, because you're the canon. Be the canon. Anda unach inach sati. And then adjust standards that are historically exclusive of Indigenous intellectual authority. It's hard. I know it's going to be hard. You might have a science class, and I don't know how you take a science class and say, well, that's how we get a halibut, because we went to the bottom of the ocean. Someone went there and talked to a halibut, and that's what they said. I don't know. Figure it out. You're smart people. So let's talk about agreements on safe space. This is a safe space. You might feel like I'm aggressive. You might feel like if you see Indigenous people talking, you might think that they're aggressive. Someone came up to me a summer or two ago and said, I didn't even know Tlingit people laughed. That was fun. I said, we've been laughing this whole time, but people have been stealing stuff, so we're not always making jokes about it. But usually we make a lot of jokes when no one's looking. But agreements on safe spaces. Equity and cultural safety are key concepts in this discussion and in other discussions. This should be part of your understanding of how vocabularies work, languages work, social structures work, power dynamics. We're committed to creating and maintaining a safe space that is conscious of the destructive nature of colonization and systemic racism, and how it contributes to inequity historically and today. The conversations we have are beyond the level of individuals in terms of scope, but certainly influence day-to-day relationships between peoples, cultures, and organizations. Critical to these discussions is the ability to listen carefully and critically, meaning that you allow others to finish their thoughts and to do so as an engaged listener. In order to assist with these discussions, it is important to have clarity on the terms commonly used to establish the guidelines for group discussion, critical inquiry, and the presentation of work. Because of the social and power dynamics involved, these are stable definitions, meaning that for the purpose of our work in decolonizing institutions and rooting out systemic inequity, these definitions are not adjustable based on personal interpretation. The reason for that is social power is often used to diffuse discussions of oppression and marginalization in ways that keep power with colonizing forces. So non-negotiable. Although we can talk. If you think there's things that really need adjust, let's talk. That doesn't mean you can't talk about it, but that means if we're getting together to talk about how to deal with these things, I don't want us to engage in a 20-minute discussion about what this particular word means to you. And I also don't want to talk about how someone was mean to one other person. I'm talking about systemic stuff. And we need to have forums for that. We need to have compassion for each other. We need to love each other. We need to have respect. Everything has a spirit. Because of that, we respect everything. But that means that sometimes it's time to listen. So cultural safety. Individuals have the right to define themselves independent of the stereotypes of others. They also have the right to define what is safe for their well-being, and institutions operate conscious of historical traumas and current inequities. Some people get mad. They don't want to do this stuff, and that's okay. But maybe you can go somewhere else. I don't know. We got to create these safe spaces, and I'll be pretty firm about those safe spaces. Equity. Equity is meeting an unmet need, from recruitment to attainment, and is the absence of disparity. I like the absence of disparity myself for equity. That means if you look at it, failure rate's about the same, poverty rate's about the same, incarceration rate's about the same. The answer is no to all those things. In turn, if you look across lines of race, violence, police violence, are these about the same? Not like just sheer numbers, but like just in terms of like the proportions. Equality, a concept that people should be treated the same and receive the same, regardless of any identifying features. Culture, the customs, arts, social institutions, achievements, attitudes, and behavior characteristics of a particular nation, people, or other social group. Now, this one's important because sometimes people, I had someone who says, I love Alaska Native people because you have culture and I don't. And that was a white male who said that. I said, of course you got culture, man. It's everywhere. It's dominating everything, right? But did you go to brunch on Sunday? You have Christmas dinner? Do you have Christmas? Like those are all cultural things. There's a Chekhov play on campus. That's a cultural thing. Just because it's in this category of what's commonly considered white or invisible, that doesn't mean it's not cultural. It doesn't also doesn't mean it's not ethnic. Ethnicity, a population whose members identify with each other on the basis of a real or presumed common genealogy or ancestry. So you can be a different ethnicity and you can have the same culture. You be same ethnicity and have different culture. They're not completely tied to each other. Race is a social construct of identity based on the conglomeration of ethnicities and cultures which have been employed to develop systems of privilege and inequity. And so this is where it gets really hard. It's really hard. We got to keep engaging in these conversations. People have told me, including some of my own relatives, the real racism is you talking about racism. And I think that's absolutely not true. But everybody can have their opinion. I'm ready. Let's debate. I'm fine. But when are we debating? When we're trying to fix a problem? Let's fix the problem and then you and I can debate later. We'll go have some coffee. Or tea, whatever. Privilege, a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. So when we talk about privilege, some people get really mad because it sounds like we're calling them pampered or that they don't work hard or something. But it's really just about like, what can you do that other people can't? Can you walk around at night, feel safe? Or do you have to like always go with a friend? Can you go on a date with someone just out somewhere? Or are they gonna call you names and throw stuff at you? Because I've seen that. Prejudice, opinion or feeling formed beforehand without knowledge, thought, or reason. It's okay. We all have them, but we need to acknowledge what they are, what they do, and when they come from a place that's harmful. Discrimination, the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, gender, or sexual orientation. It's horrible. It can happen to anybody. Racism, any attitude, action, or institutional structure which subordinates a person or group because of their race and employs concepts of superiority and inferiority based on the construct of race. Systemic racism, the development of norms, standards, expectations, and performance analyses that are based in racist concepts of superiority or modernity, or that employs notions of normal or expected behavior without considering identities outside of the hegemonic race, gender, sexual orientation, and class. So when we start getting into concepts of normal and just do what feels right, sometimes I think we really have to question that. Cultural appropriation, the taking of intellectual property, cultural expressions, or artifacts, history, and ways of knowledge from a culture that is not one's own. Cultural exchange, the appropriation of a culture that is not one's own without taking it and without representing it through the lens of one's own culture. 2 more pages of this, and then we get to just chat. Colonialism, The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Coloniality, the invisible and constitutive side of modernity, meaning a colonization of knowledge and institutions to the point where imbalances of power are naturalized, expected, and reproduced without conscious efforts to do so. So it's sort of like you don't even have to colonize people anymore. It's just like the population will just go forward and do it without really thinking about what they're doing. Some of them will, some of them will. Modernity, the idea that humanity is progressing along a universal track of evolution and development, and that other cultures and peoples can be measured where they are developmental wise. I don't think I finished that one. But it's basically this idea like we're here at this, what we call this age, and we see you guys over here, that means you guys are heading here and we need to help you get here. It's done. That's created a lot of problems. Cultural hegemony or hegemony. Power that maintains its authority without the need for violent coercion through the creation and maintenance of an idea of what is expected or normal for groups of people that is by nature exclusive and colonial. An example of this, someone asked me like, what do I mean by that? And I said, well, we're in a village. 100 years ago, everybody spoke Tlingit in this village. Now, hardly anybody does. You are the most powerful person in the school. You and the school board could say, okay, starting tomorrow, we'll do half our day in Tlingit, half our day in English. We just gotta get this language back to a safe place. But you would feel like you can't. And I bet you couldn't really tell me why. Everything that you would say was probably not something that you could readily prove. You would feel like you're doing something wrong or you're doing a disservice to the kids. But I don't think you really would be. Neocolonialism, whoops, there shouldn't be an or there. The practice of using capitalism, globalization, cultural imperialism, and conditional aid to influence a developing country instead of the previous colonial methods of direct military control, which is imperialism, or indirect political control, which is hegemony. Internal colonialism, the reproduction of colonialism within a group of peoples who have experienced a violent and assimilative process of colonization and then employs similar tactics to control and or assimilate one's own people. Last page of definitions, folks. Decolonization, the undoing of colonialism, which can occur upon a wide spectrum of outcomes, ranging from the removal of coloniality in institutions, governments, social groups, and individuals, to the removal of colonial governing structures and results in the empowerment of colonized groups and individuals. It's a spectrum. And it's good for us as UAS or whatever your institution is to define it. What does that mean to you? Decoloniality, the untangling of knowledge from coloniality with specific efforts to decentralize Eurocentrism and abolish concepts of superiority and inferiority that are based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and culture. Now we have systemic equity. That's the goal, folks. Efforts to reshape and reconstruct institutions and governments in ways that not only counter hegemony and coloniality, but that make their existence within these systems impossible through a balance of power and an elevation of voices that have been historically marginalized to the point that disorientation and adversity are equally shared and success and comfort do not require a sacrifice of identity. That's what we're going for. That's hard to do because everything else to this point has largely been constructed on something different. CNN would say something else. So why is colonialism bad? I just want to touch on that for a second. Colonialism is a destructive and horrible thing. That doesn't mean that you are a destructive and horrible person. That doesn't mean, we just have to look at this thing and what really happened. I got this idea for this based on conversations with folks from the Hokalea. So colonialism sought to do a number of things that I think were done very deliberately. You eliminate the warrior society, and this wasn't sequentially, it was all done at the same time. You eliminate warrior societies. So then the men cannot defend their communities, and they also lose their role. And it's not just men, you can have women warriors, right? But then when there's no defense, you can now rape and murder the women. My great-grandpa tells stories about when the Navy came. That's when we started finding our women washing up on the beaches covered in seaweed. And that's how they got us. That's how they nearly destroyed us, because all of our identity flows through our women. There's a reason why missing and murdered Indigenous women needs to be the next critical social movement, because it's an epidemic. It's an epidemic of American culture that has an origin point, which is day one of colonization. And it hasn't stopped. Because if you look at what's the overwhelming majority of people who are committing violent crimes against Native women? It's white males. You separate the people from the land. You make them foreigners to their own land. You make them lazy. You do all these things to separate them. You give the land all these different names from white men, usually. I don't know who Mendenhall is. There's all these people, I don't know who they are. That place has a name. That place had a name. So I really like this concept of a friend of mine shared with me. It said when the Haida on Haida Gwaii are restoring their traditional place names. So what they'll do is they'll take some Mendenhall Glacier, they'll make put it on a nice piece of paper, commission a bent wood box, nice box, all carved up and everything. Put that name in there, have a ceremony, respectfully return it to the colonizers. We'll give this back to the government. We have a name, thank you. And then you separate the people from their language. Fewer than 1% of the Tlingit people can speak their own language. Same with Haida. And I'm not exactly sure what the percentage is with Tsimshian, as far as their total percentage of total speakers is probably less than 10%. So we have to look at this, because then you prescribe an identity legally. Indigenous people were not allowed to be themselves. They wanted to vote, they had to sign a piece of paper that says, I will not live the Indigenous way. I won't speak my language, I won't live with my people. And I had to get 5 white people to sign, to vouch for me. That means if somebody saw me speaking my language somewhere, they'd come take away my American citizenship. Couldn't vote, couldn't decide where my kids go to school, couldn't own land. It's like, and so, but then you can't only not be an Indigenous person, but you cannot really be a white person. Even now, like if my kids want to have ambitions, be president of the United States, I'm gonna say, yes, you can go do that thing. But then I'm gonna think, who that child's gotta climb a tall hill? So anyways, this is inward banishment. You're separated from everything. You gotta know where to go. Some people ask me sometimes, why Alaska Natives drinking? Why is the poverty? Why is this? Ooh, you know, and there seems to be this fascination with why things are so bad. But there also seems to be a reluctance to look at what has been going on, right? It'd be like if I just came in the room and just beat the hell out of somebody. And then I turn around and said, why are they having a hard time? Jeez, right? I mean, it's just, it's wild. But this is the education system we live in. It doesn't want us to look at these things. So what we're gonna do, those who want to engage, you don't want to engage, that's fine. You get to make your decision. But you're gonna continue to be part of the problem. And the problem here is inhumane. Don't be inhumane. Even if the emperor says, come the dark side, we got yummy cookies, don't do it. But if you want to be part of change that's looking at making things better for people, then we're going to become a rope. We're going to braid ourselves right up, because a rope's hard to break. So you might be someone who's from another community, who's one of our allies. You might be someone who's just new to the whole idea of working together to combat systemic inequity. But that means there's a place for you. It's a place at the table. The metaphor I like is our ancestors they've cooked all their favorite foods. And then they're just saying, come and eat with us, grandchild. We are people of kindness. We're people of respect. We're people of deep thought. All that's reflected in our language. If you ever want to challenge yourself, come learn one of our languages. It's hard stuff. But I'll sort of wrap up with this. This is from Cuskey, Susie James, from a Raven story. She says, after that, after her child was born, Raven was like a fortress, I guess. This Raven who arranged the world. So we're going to build a fort around you all who are trying to do this work. There might be people in your department. There might be people who are in your class who are going to make fun of you, who are going to try and get under your skin, who are going to try to stop you, who are going to label you as angry, out of control, hurtful, attacking. And so, but I want to strategize as well, because sometimes if we talk from a place of anger, we're not going to get right. So sometimes what my great grandpa used to say was, the more someone triggers you, the longer you better take before you say something, which is hard, because this is a time of social media. Everything just comes 1 second right after the other. You're supposed to be quick-witted and say something right away. But it's bigger than that. This is a long game. We've been here 10,000 plus years. We're going to be here 10,000 plus more, speaking these same languages. And one of the reasons why, we have mental fortitude, like a gumboot sitting on that rock. Thanks, folks, for listening. I gotta fix a couple things on the slides, but I'm happy to share them with folks if you want to. If you're interested in those things, if you want to talk some more. But I thought we'd just have sort of an open dialogue for these last 10 minutes or so, since you listened to me talk. Yeah, anybody got any thoughts, questions?
Hi, Lance.
Hi.
I had a thought when you were looking at slide 7. Here, let me see. I wrote it down on my phone. Okay. When you were talking about how to transfer your department or program from exclusive to inclusive, I was just thinking that it kind of starts in the high schools and the elementary in villages, like, because like if we're not preparing, like, so I was just thinking of LKSD. Like, they throw all their resources and their money into their one school in Bethel, you know, like where the white kids are. And they don't put any resources into their village schools at all. And it's really sad and upsetting. And it really hurts. Like, anytime you go to visit from the village, is like maybe from Tuxuk Bay into Bethel, it just really is upsetting to see how much money and resources the kids in Bethel have, and they're just completely ignoring the village schools, not preparing them for life after high school at all.
Yeah, and so in terms of sort of like, what are we focusing on as well? And so educational systems in Alaska have horribly failed Indigenous Alaska. And these are complicated things. They're so, yeah, but if we can just put some of these things on the table and just find ways to sort of create more equity. So like, oh, that's what they got? We'd like to have something smaller. We might be a small population. And I know in some parts of Western Alaska, my partner, Mariah, she was happened to be staying at a school while she was doing some work, and she just happened to be there just having a cup of coffee while they were talking to kids about what to do after high school. And she was so shocked that college wasn't really mentioned to these students, and that it wasn't, they were just trade school and, you know, do this and do that. And so she had sort of stepped in. She said, oh yeah, they go to college, they keep going, they get, you know. And so, but then like as these educational systems are kind of failing in certain areas, then these students come in, and then a lot of the higher education institutions, they just sort of adopt this thing like, oh yeah, if the students come from here, they're probably not going to be very good students, instead of sort of trying to figure out how do we make sure that anyone can come in, including from systems that are not very functional in terms of being able to produce lots of graduates and being able to have them as prepared as could be. And there's not easy answers, but it's time for big changes in education. Paul Burke, a colleague of mine, he said, the time for incremental change has passed. And he did a lot of work in Western Alaska. A lot of his thoughts were in some of these larger school districts, and trying to figure out what can be done statewide to make things more efficient and more equitable.
And replying to the chat, like, I'm not saying they have to be prepared for like any particular type of life. Just like if they wanted to go to do something, like they should have the, like, you know, the resources that this district should be like providing in order to be successful in that, if they wanted to go do that.
Yes, absolutely. Let's take I see Dan had a hand up.
Hey, Lance, thanks. So I've just got a naive question. Being new here, trying to figure out things, I've always wondered about the land acknowledgement, and I would just like to hear you talk about, because you mentioned about what would be in there, and then also you just very briefly said about who, and to me that's something that I've been kind of anxious about, because it's what I'm getting. As somebody who does not yet understand, is that who speaks is actually really important here locally, right? So if something should be given by the respected elders of a certain moiety at certain times, and so I've been anxious, should I be giving a land acknowledgement? Is that my place to do? And so I guess I'd like to hear your reflections on whether or not people from the outside should, and then if they should, how should they?
Yeah, it might depend sort of on the context. Like, so is this a public event that's hosted by your organization, and are you speaking on behalf? And so on behalf of that organization, I think being thankful for whose land you're on is a good thing. And then also saying a few things specifically about those people, and then what your commitments are to be a partner. And I think those are important. And I think it's been fun to watch this transition as we sort of go forward and see how the land acknowledgements process sort of develops. And so I'd be happy to talk with you more on like specifics, just because it might depend on where you are and what the situation is. Like, if it's a birthday party or something, it doesn't really have to go. But if it's like, this is a public event that's sponsored and where it involves people, then it steps into this other realm. Okay, I think we got time for one more. Sianjin, I don't want to say your name wrong. It's like maybe a Tlingit name.
I want to be as brief as possible, but my mind is exploding with so many things lately. And actually, the first thing occurred in a class that we were having the other day. And randomly in the middle of talking about our oral tradition, the topic of racism just briefly came up. And later on, I had this sudden recognition of, oh my gosh, is that the missing piece that people outside of our Native communities just don't have the same reflex for? Because thinking about how we have an oral tradition, and as a part of that oral tradition, like one of the things, so many people always want to thwart the validity of our oral tradition, because they want to use things like, oh, well, have you ever played telephone? And how do they mess it up so badly? And the lack of recognition for our oral tradition, not knowing that we have to listen to those stories over and over before we ever get permission to retell that story. And then on top of that, once we are able to start retelling that story, that we have to have the reflex in our culture, in our tradition, to accept correction. And so that whenever we tell something, whenever we speak on something, we have to be willing to listen, to learn if somebody, you know, jumps up and notices that we've done something wrong, said something wrong, etc. And that in our culture and our tradition, it's not that we fight for how we're so right. We have to accept that moment, that opportunity to learn how to improve. And all of a sudden it snapped in for me, is that the cultural piece that's missing for people outside of our Native communities, outside of our Indigenous communities, that there isn't that cultural tradition, because we've been living by an oral tradition for thousands of years. And so is that the reflex that's missing outside of our community? If somebody calls out racism, if somebody calls out like, hey, what you just did or what you just said is offensive. And, you know, outside of our community, there's that reflex that I'm going to prove why I'm not racist. I'm going to prove why I'm not wrong. And I'm going to tell you why what I did wasn't racist. And to me, that was kind of like an aha moment of like, is that the difference, and why there's such a conflict with how we communicate and how we interact with each other. And then second to that, one of the best ways that I've come to in trying to talk about racism to other people is that racism at the very foundation is narcissistic abuse. And when you're being abused, it's not okay for the abuser to say, hey, I didn't hurt you. If a victim is calling out the fact that something, you know, offended them, hurt their feelings, or meant something to them that, you know, whether it was intentional or unintended, narcissistic abuse is simply the fact of not acknowledging when someone has harmed someone else. Invalidation, gaslighting. And so when you look at racism as a societal issue, it's a societal issue of narcissistic abuse. So when people call out like, hey, that was offensive, or, you know, this isn't appropriate for this situation or circumstance, like, instead of society, especially outside of our community, without having that cultural knowledge, without having that cultural reflex to listen, to learn, there's that reflex to invalidate, to gaslight, to prove why that person outside of our community didn't do anything wrong. So it's almost like, how do we develop the reflex for people who are listening to us to listen, to learn, instead of listening to gaslight, invalidate, and perpetuate harm? And I hope that that's like where the conversation starts to open up, instead of being received as like offensive, like, how dare you say I was offensive or inappropriate? Because I think everybody in our society at some level has an understanding of narcissistic abuse and how it feels.
We've hit the 4 o'clock mark, so we will keep the conversation going. I want to acknowledge your words, and I want to say those are great points. And I just want to advise everybody, if someone's talking about racism, someone's talking about misogyny, someone's talking about homophobia, stop and listen and consider what might be happening, and try not to discredit their reality, which sometimes is instinctual and sometimes is just really not being a good friend and not being a good ally. So thank you so much, everybody. I'm really thankful to my colleagues and my students, my family, who helped to inform the platform from which I am able to speak. So, gunchish.